I built the crib with my own hands, painted the walls, counted down the days. Then our daughter arrived, and the delivery room told me everything my wife of 9 years never had the courage to say. I walked out with nothing but the truth, and the truth turned out to be the most dangerous thing she ever underestimated. My name is Franklin Hurst. I'm 53 years old, and I'm a senior mechanical supervisor at Delwood Industrial. Been there 19 years, worked my way up from the floor. I know how machines work. I know how to listen for the sound that doesn't belong, the vibration that's a half degree off, the pressure reading that looks fine until it doesn't. I built a career on paying attention to details. Turns out I was better at reading machines than I was at reading people. Colleen and I got married 9 years ago. She was 35, I was 44, and yeah, people raised their eyebrows. A 9-year gap isn't the end of the world, but I heard the whispers at the reception. What does he think he's doing? My buddy Bart pulled me aside that night and said, half joking, "You sure about this, Frank?" I laughed it off. I was sure. She was sharp, driven, beautiful in that particular way that makes you feel lucky just to be in the same room. She'd worked her way up to regional marketing director at Hargrove Consumer Group, and she carried herself like she knew exactly where she was going. For the first several years, things were good. Not perfect. Nothing is, but solid. We talked about kids early on, and the honest answer was, she wasn't ready, and I respected that. Then the years went by, and the subject softened into something we didn't really touch anymore. I told myself I'd made peace with it. Then, 14 months ago, Colleen told me she was pregnant. I remember sitting down on the edge of the bed, hands on my knees, just staring at the carpet. She was watching me with this careful expression, like she wasn't sure which way I'd go. And then something opened up in my chest, something warm and ridiculous and completely unexpected, and I started laughing. She laughed too. We both did, the way you laugh when something surprises you into happiness. I was going to be a father at 53. I couldn't believe it. I threw myself into it the way I throw myself into any project worth doing, completely. I spent a weekend converting the spare bedroom, measuring twice, cutting once the way my father drilled into me. I built the crib from scratch, white oak, sanded smooth as glass, every joint checked and double-checked. I painted the walls a pale yellow, 3 coats to get the shade exactly right. Colleen stood in the doorway one evening, hand on her belly, and told me it was perfect. I believed her. The first small thing I noticed was the phone. Colleen had always been plugged in. Marketing people live and die by their devices, but this was different. She started carrying it face down, angled away when she typed. Quick movements, screen going dark. I noticed it the way I notice an unfamiliar sound on the floor. Filed it away, didn't act on it. The second thing was a Thursday in November. She came home at 9:40 instead of her usual 7 o'clock. Said the Hargrove Regional Review had run long. I nodded. It wasn't even the lateness that caught my attention. It was the way she said it. Flat. Rehearsed. Like a reading, not a conversation. I didn't say anything. I went back to the game I'd been half watching. But that night, I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe beside me. I told myself I was being paranoid. She was 8 months pregnant, running a demanding team, probably exhausted. I told myself the best thing I could do was be steady, be the calm one. So I was calm. I sanded the shelf brackets. I hung the curtains in the nursery. I sat in the rocking chair I'd brought up from the basement and looked at the crib I'd built with my own 2 hands and thought, this is what matters. 3 weeks later, our daughter was born, and the delivery room told me everything Colleen never would. I've been a mechanic long enough to know that nothing breaks all at once. It starts with something small, a vibration, a temperature reading half a degree off, a sound that's just slightly wrong. You can ignore it. Plenty of guys do. But the machine always tells you the truth eventually, one way or another. Colleen's truth started showing up in the credit card statements. I handle our finances. Always have. She never objected. Numbers weren't her thing. And honestly, keeping the accounts organized gave me something to do with my hands on Sunday evenings. I've been doing it for 9 years without finding anything worth a second look. Then, 2 weeks after the Thursday she came home late, I sat down with 3 months of statements and actually read them. The pattern was right there, patient as anything, waiting for me to notice. Every Thursday, without fail, dinner charges at restaurants I didn't recognize. Not near her office on the north side. These were Crosstown, a good 40-minute drive from Hargrove. The Park Meridian Grill. Castillo's on Westfield. A place called the Lantern that I'd never heard her mention. And tucked in between, for separate charges at the Bellhaven Suites, a hotel near the interstate, $42 each time, which I knew from looking it up was a rate for a day use room. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. I just sat there at the kitchen table with the statements laid out in front of me, and something cold and very quiet settled in my chest. I didn't say anything to Colleen that night. I needed to think before I spoke, because once you say certain words out loud, you can't take them back. I know that about myself. The following week, I mentioned it casually over dinner, said I'd noticed some charges I didn't recognize, and asked if she'd switched where she was taking clients. She barely looked up from her plate. Said the Hargrove team had been trying out new venues for relationship-building dinners. Said the hotel charges were for a colleague who needed a quiet place to prep before a big presentation and had put on the wrong car by mistake. She offered to get the reimbursement sorted. It was smooth, practiced, and it would have worked on the version of me from 2 months ago. I nodded and said, "Sure, no rush." Then I went and checked the statements again after she went to bed. The hotel charges went back 11 months. 11. That was not a billing error. The next Thursday, I left Delwood 40 minutes early and drove Crosstown. I parked on Fenwick Street, down the block from the Bellhaven Suites, and I waited. I had a gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder and the radio off. At 6:22 p.m., Colleen's silver Accord pulled into the hotel lot. She didn't look around. She moved like someone who'd done this many times, straight to the side entrance, key card already out. A dark blue Lexus was already parked in the lot. I wrote down the plate number on the back of a receipt. I sat there for 2 hours. I didn't go in. I didn't call. I just sat with what I was looking at until I was sure I wasn't misreading it, the way you double-check a gauge reading before you shut down the whole line. She emerged at 8:47, got in her car, drove home. I followed at a distance and arrived 10 minutes after she did, told her I'd stop for gas. She was already in the kitchen reheating leftovers, relaxed as Sunday morning, and asked if I was hungry. I said no. The following day, I called Bart. We've been friends since we were both 22 and working the same shift at Carver Manufacturing, back before I moved up and he moved into sales. Bart isn't the type to sugarcoat things, which is exactly why I called him. We met at Ronnie's Diner, a booth in the back. I laid out what I'd found, the statements, the hotel, what I'd seen Thursday night. Bart listened without interrupting, which wasn't like him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long?" he finally asked. 11 months at minimum, I told him. He exhaled slowly and looked out the window. Then he turned back and said, "Frank, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it before you react." He leaned forward, forearms on the table. "About 2 months ago, I saw Colleen at Marcello's, that Italian place on Route 9. I was there with a client. She was with a man I didn't recognize." He paused. They weren't talking business. I looked at him across the table for a long moment. "And you didn't say anything." I told myself I was probably reading it wrong, that it wasn't my place. He met my eyes. "I'm sorry, Frank. I should have said something." I didn't blow up at him. I wanted to, for about half a second. But Bart was sitting there owning it, and that counted for something. I just nodded and said we'd deal with that later. What I needed right now was a name. Bart, as it turned out, had one. His client at Marcello's that night knew the man. Said his name was Darnell Okafor, ran a commercial real estate consultancy on the west side. 38 years old, 15 years younger than me, 9 years younger than Colleen. I drove home that afternoon, went straight to the nursery, and stood in the doorway looking at the crib I'd built. The yellow walls, the shelf of books I've been collecting since October. I stood there for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and started making a list of everything I needed to know. I've never been the kind of man who goes looking for a fight. I've always believed that if you gather enough information first, you don't have to fight. You just have to be right. And being right, when it matters, is worth taking your time over. So I took my time. The week after my conversation with Bart, I drove to Calvary Ridge Community Church on a Tuesday morning, before the early service crowd showed up. Pastor Howard Gilliam had been our pastor for 6 years. He was a steady, soft-spoken man in his late 60s, the kind of minister who remembered your mother's birthday and knew which pew you preferred. Colleen and I had been regulars since we moved to the neighborhood. She sang in the choir. I ran the annual facilities repair drive every spring. I found him in his office, going over notes. He looked up when I knocked, and something moved across his face, just briefly, just a flicker, before he arranged it back into his usual expression of welcome. That flicker told me what I needed to know before I even sat down. Franklin. He rose and extended his hand. Good to see you. What brings you in on a Tuesday? I shook his hand and sat across from him. I'm going to ask you something directly, Pastor, because I think you're a man who respects directness. He settled back in his chair and folded his hands on the desk. Waited. Has Colleen spoken to you in a pastoral capacity about something that involves our marriage? The silence lasted about 4 seconds. In my experience, 4 seconds is a long time for an honest man to think about a simple question. You know, I can't discuss private conversations, Franklin. I'm not asking you to break a confidence, I said. I'm asking you to look me in the eye and tell me you have no concerns about the state of my marriage. Another silence. He looked at me steadily, but he didn't say the words. A man of God, and he couldn't say the words. I nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Franklin, he began. I'm not angry at you, I said, and I meant it. You were put in a position you didn't ask for. I understand that. I stood and picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. But I want you to know that whatever she told you, whatever version she gave you, there's another side to it, and that side is going to come out. I left him sitting there with his hands still folded on the desk. Driving back to Delwood, I felt something sharpen inside me. Not anger. Clarity. The kind you get when the last piece fits and you finally understand the full shape of the problem. Colleen had been laying groundwork. She hadn't just been conducting an affair. She'd been managing how the people around us perceived it. The pastor. Probably others. She was building herself a cushion for whatever came next. That evening, I came home to find a young man sitting at my kitchen table. Colleen introduced him as Tanner Briggs, 27, a junior account manager on her team at Hargrove. She said he'd stopped by to drop off some campaign materials she'd left at the office. He was polished, friendly, shook my hand with the particular confidence of someone who's been coached on first impressions. Said he'd heard a lot about me. I said I couldn't say the same. After Colleen walked him out, I went to my office and looked up Tanner Briggs on LinkedIn. His profile was clean, Hargrove Consumer Group, 2 years. But what caught my eye was a comment thread on a local business networking group, 6 months old. Someone had tagged him at Castillo's on Westfield, one of the restaurants from Colleen's credit card statements, thanking him for arranging a wonderful client dinner. Not a Hargrove client. The tag was from a commercial real estate firm, Darnell Okafor's firm. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Tanner Briggs wasn't just a junior colleague. He was the logistics man, the one who made the reservations, sent the confirmation texts, kept things from showing up anywhere they shouldn't. 27 years old. Probably thought he was doing his boss a favor, maybe getting a little extra goodwill in return. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I just saved the screenshot and added it to the folder I'd been building on my laptop, password protected, backed up to an external drive I kept in my toolbox at Delwood. That night, after Colleen went to bed, I sat in the nursery for a while. The yellow walls, the oak crib, the books lined up on the shelf, spines facing out, alphabetical. I'd done that myself on a Saturday afternoon in November while Colleen was at what she called team brunch. I thought about what Pastor Howard hadn't said. I thought about Tanner Briggs and his confident handshake. I thought about 11 months of Thursdays. And I made a decision. Before this went any further, I was going to know everything. Every piece, every connection, every detail. Because when the time came, and it was coming, I wasn't going to have a conversation. I was going to have a record. 3 weeks before her due date, Colleen went into labor early. It was a Wednesday night. She woke me at 2 a.m. Contractions, close together, no time to wait. I got her bag, got her to the car, drove to St. Clement's Medical Center with my hand steady on the wheel and my mind already running through contingencies the way it always does when something breaks ahead of schedule. The labor lasted 9 hours. I sat in the room with her, got her iced chips, talked to the nurses when she didn't feel like talking. I did everything you're supposed to do. I held her hand through the hard parts. And when the baby arrived, I was standing 2 feet away. The delivery nurse, a composed woman named Rita who'd been calm and efficient throughout the whole night, lifted our daughter, and in that first moment, before anyone said a word, I watched Rita's face. She didn't look at me the way nurses look at new fathers. She looked at me the way people look at someone standing on the edge of something they can't stop. The baby was beautiful. She had a full head of dark hair and wide, alert eyes, and her skin was a warm, deep brown that belonged to neither Colleen nor me. I am Irish and German by ancestry, pale as February. Colleen's family is Finnish and Scottish. There was no genetic combination between us that produced what I was looking at. The room went quiet in a particular way. The attending physician found something important in his chart. Rita busied herself with the warmer. The resident near the door took a small step back. Colleen looked at the baby. Then she looked at me. Her face didn't show confusion. It showed calculation. That quick, almost invisible recalibration I'd seen once before, the night I'd mentioned the credit card charges. For just a moment, behind her eyes, I could see her working out what to say. She didn't get the chance. Franklin, she started, voice low and careful. I need you to let me. No, I said. Just the one word. She stopped. I looked at my wife of 9 years across that hospital room, in the gray morning light coming through the window blinds, and I felt 9 years of something. Not anger, not grief exactly, something colder and more final than either, settle in a place like a load-bearing wall clicking into position. I know, I said. I've known for a while. I just needed to be sure. She opened her mouth, closed it. I turned to Rita, who was watching me with quiet, careful eyes. Is there a waiting area nearby? Down the hall, left at the nurse's station, she said gently. I'll bring you coffee. I picked up my jacket from the chair and walked out. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the floor squeaked faintly under my boots. I found the waiting area. 4 chairs, a window overlooking the parking structure, a vending machine with a broken coin return. I sat down and put my hands on my knees and breathed. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. I had the folder. I had Bart. I had a name and a plan and a lawyer lined up through a referral I'd quietly obtained from a colleague at Delwood whose own divorce had been handled well. I was ready. None of that stopped the weight of it from landing. I sat there for a long time. The morning shift change came and went. At 7:15, my phone buzzed. Bart, who I'd texted from the car at 2:30 a.m. On my way. 20 minutes. When he walked into that waiting room, still wearing his work jacket, I didn't say anything. He sat down beside me, looked straight ahead, and said, "Tell me." So I did. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need right now?" "I need to make a call," I told him. "And then I need to get out of this building." He nodded once. "I'll drive." Bart drove me home from St. Clement's at 8:40 in the morning. Not my home, that was the plan we'd worked out in the waiting room over bad vending machine coffee, while the hospital shifted into its daytime rhythm around us. I wasn't going back to that house while Colleen was still in the delivery ward. I needed clear space to think, and thinking in a house full of yellow nursery walls and 9 years of accumulated lies wasn't something I was capable of just then. Bart's guest room was plain and impersonal in the best possible way. A bed, a dresser, a window facing the backyard. No photographs of anyone. I sat on the edge of the mattress and called Robert Hines, the family law attorney I'd found 3 weeks earlier through a referral from Dale Spruill, a senior engineer at Delwood who'd gone through his own divorce 2 years back and come out the other side with his house and his dignity intact. Hines answered on the 3rd ring. I'd already left him a message the previous evening, the just-in-case message I told myself I was probably being paranoid to send. "Mr. Hurst," he said, "I take it the baby arrived." "Last night," I said, "early. And the situation is confirmed." A brief pause. "Are you somewhere safe and private?" "Yes." "Then let's talk." We spent 40 minutes on the phone. I walked him through everything I had. The credit card records organized by date, the Belhaven Suites charges, the Tanner Briggs connection, the LinkedIn screenshot, the photo I'd taken of Darnell Okafor's Lexus plate from Fenwick Street. Hines listened without interrupting, asked 2 precise follow-up questions, and then said something that surprised me. "You've done exceptional preparation, Mr. Hurst. What I'm seeing here gives us significant leverage on multiple fronts: marital asset misuse, potential fraud relating to paternity representation, and we'll want to look closely at any estate documents as well." Estate documents. The thought hit me sideways. In all my preparation, I hadn't checked the will. After I hung up, I called Bart into the room and asked him to drive me to the house that afternoon. Colleen wouldn't be discharged for at least 36 hours. The window was clean. We arrived at 2:15. Walking through the front door felt strange, not unfamiliar, but altered, The way a room looks different after the furniture's been rearranged. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, and none of it felt like mine anymore. I worked quickly and methodically. Bedroom first. Clothes, my father's watch, the service medals from his army days that I kept in a cedar box on the closet shelf. Personal documents from the filing cabinet. My original birth certificate, passport, the inheritance paperwork from my father's estate that showed the $180,000 down payment on this house had come from his savings, not from joint funds. I kept meticulous records of that, as I kept meticulous records of everything, a habit that had seemed boring for decades and was now worth its weight. Then I opened the fireproof safe in my office. Behind the insurance policies and the property deed was an envelope I didn't recognize. Recent. The seal had that slightly stiff quality of paper that's only been handled a few times. Inside was a notarized amendment to Colleen's personal will, dated 4 months ago. I read it twice, standing there in my own office in the afternoon quiet. She'd changed the beneficiary on her life insurance policy, $340,000, from me to the baby. Standard enough, perhaps. But she'd also amended the disposition of her personal property to route everything through a family trust of which the baby was the sole beneficiary, with Colleen named as sole trustee. In other words, if something happened to me, the money went to the child, and the child's assets would be controlled entirely by Colleen. I photographed every page with my phone, put the envelope back exactly as I'd found it, and locked the safe. Bart was waiting in the hallway. He looked at my face and said nothing, just nodded toward the door. I saved the nursery for last. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The yellow walls, the oak crib I'd spent 3 weekends building, the shelf of books, the mobile turning slowly in the draft from the hallway. Then I went in and started taking it apart, not in anger, methodically, the way I'd built it, one piece at a time, each part set carefully against the wall. The crib came apart in 12 minutes. I loaded it in a Bart's truck along with the shelf brackets and the mobile and 3 boxes of books. The walls I left yellow. Let her paint them. The crib and everything that went with it, I dropped at the Crossroads family shelter on the way back to Bart's place. I told the woman at the intake desk it was in good condition, built solid, should last years. She thanked me warmly. I said it was no trouble and drove away before she could say anything else. That evening, sitting at Bart's kitchen table with a cup of coffee I wasn't really tasting, I called Hines back and told him about the will amendment. That's exactly the kind of thing I was looking for, he said, and I could hear his tone shift into something more focused. Combined with what you already have, we're not just looking at a standard divorce filing. We're looking at a pattern of deliberate financial preparation concurrent with the affair. That carries weight in court. What's our next step? I asked. I file Monday morning, Hines said, and I want to include language around the paternity question from the outset. Don't let that get buried. It needs to be front and center. I agreed. After I hung up, I sat for a while longer, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the day decompress. Outside, Bart's dog was barking at something in the yard. A neighbor's sprinkler ran its slow arc back and forth. Normal life, going on around me. I get back to it. It would just look different than I'd planned. Robert Hines filed the divorce petition on Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Colleen's attorney, a woman named Deborah Strand who had a reputation for aggressive initial positioning, had responded with a counterfiling that called my petition premature, emotionally reactive, and contrary to the best interests of the minor child. The language was polished and deliberate, the kind of framing designed to paint me as a man who'd abandoned his family in a moment of crisis. I read the counterfiling at my desk at Delwood during my lunch break, ate half a sandwich, and went back to work. Hines had prepared me for exactly this. She's going to try to establish a narrative before you do, he'd told me during our Monday call. The most powerful thing you can do in the short term is give her nothing to respond to. No public statements, no emotional confrontations, no social media. Let her build her story in a vacuum. Vacuums collapse. So I said nothing. I didn't call mutual friends to get my side. I didn't respond to the 2 texts that came from Colleen's sister Brenda, who was clearly reaching out on Colleen's behalf. The second one read, "Just talk to her, Frank, she's really struggling," and I looked at it for about 10 seconds before setting my phone face down on the workbench. I didn't post anything. I didn't change my profile photos. I went to work, came home to Bart's guest room, ate dinner, and slept. What I didn't know, at first, was how busy Colleen was being on her end. Bart told me, about a week after the filing, that he'd gotten a call from our mutual friend Len Pryor, a guy we'd both known since the Carver manufacturing days, asking if Franklin was doing okay and whether the story going around was really true. When Bart asked what story, Len said Colleen had reached out to several people saying that I'd had a breakdown at the hospital, walked out on her and the baby in her most vulnerable moment, and was now making vindictive legal threats out of wounded pride. I filed that away without reacting. The second piece came from Alan Weaver, my department head at Delwood. He stopped by my workstation on a Thursday and asked, quietly, if everything was all right, because my wife had called the main office line asking to reach me, and the receptionist had mentioned it to him. She called my workplace, not my cell, the main line. I thanked Alan, told him I was handling a personal situation and would appreciate it if calls from my wife were directed to my voicemail, not routed through the office. He nodded without pressing. 2 days later, I learned from Hines that Colleen had retained a crisis communications consultant, a local PR professional who specialized in what her website called personal narrative management during high-conflict family transitions. She was paying someone, out of joint funds, to manage how the public perceived her divorce. Hines included documentation of the payment in our supplemental filing. The judge, he told me, was unlikely to look favorably on marital assets being used to fund a publicity campaign. Meanwhile, Darnell Okafor's attorney had sent a letter to Colleen's attorney formally stating that his client had no paternal claim to or interest in the minor child born April 14th. He was stepping away cleanly, leaving Colleen holding a situation she'd spent 14 months carefully engineering, and she was holding it alone. I won't pretend that didn't give me a grim kind of satisfaction. The thing about staying silent when someone is trying to define you is that it requires a particular kind of discipline. Every instinct says to push back, to correct the record, to make sure people know the truth. But the truth was in the documents. It was in the credit card statements, the hotel records, the amended will, the LinkedIn thread connecting Tanner Briggs to Darnell Okafor's firm. The truth didn't need me to carry it. It could carry itself. What silence gave me was control. And control, right now, was the most valuable thing I had. 3 weeks after the filing, I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town. Bart helped me carry boxes on a Saturday morning. The place was clean, quiet, and entirely empty of anything that didn't belong to me. I set up my workbench in the second bedroom, unpacked my father's toolbox, and that evening I started working on a small oak side table. Nothing special, just something to do with my hands. The apartment smelled like fresh paint and possibility. I was starting to remember what that felt like. 3 weeks after I filed, Colleen came to Delwood Industrial. I was on the floor running a diagnostic on the secondary press line when Alan Weaver appeared at my elbow and said quietly that there was a woman at the front reception asking for me by name and that she wasn't taking, he's unavailable for an answer. I knew before he finished the sentence. I told Alan I'd handle it, washed my hands at the floor sink, and walked up to reception. Colleen was standing near the front desk in a gray blazer, the baby carrier in one hand, her face composed in that careful, professional way she used when she needed to project control. Several people in the open plan area had already looked up. "We need to talk," she said, as though we were picking up a conversation from earlier that morning. "This isn't the place," I said. I kept my voice level and my expression neutral. "And we have attorneys for a reason. You've been blocking my calls." Her voice held a slight edge now. "You can't just shut me out entirely, Franklin. We were married for 9 years. "I'm aware of that," I said, "which is why I have an attorney handling communication instead of doing something I'd regret. I'd suggest you do the same." She glanced around. The receptionist, 2 engineers pretending to read documents, a guy from shipping frozen halfway through pouring himself coffee. Colleen had always been good at reading a room. She lowered her voice. "You're doing this to punish me. You know that. Everything you've built, the legal strategy, the silence, all of it. It's about making me feel as small as possible." I looked at her steadily. "I'm doing this because you spent 14 months lying to me, used our money to conduct an affair and rewrite a will, let me build a nursery for a child you knew wasn't mine, and then filed on me before I could file on you. I'm not punishing you, Colleen. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference, and you know it." She opened her mouth, closed it. "Please don't come to my workplace again," I said. "If you do, I'll ask security to escort you out, And that's a conversation neither of us wants to have in front of an audience. I turned to Alan, who was standing a discreet distance away. Alan, could you see Miss Hurst out? He nodded. I walked back to the floor. My hand was steady. My breathing was even. I was mildly surprised by both. 4 days later, on a Saturday morning, I was in my apartment workroom shaping a side table leg when my phone rang. Unfamiliar number. 513, area code. Cincinnati. I almost let go to voicemail. Something made me answer. Is this Franklin Hurst? A young man's voice, careful and a little uncertain. It is. This is Dustin. A pause. Dustin Hurst. Your son. I set down the wood plane very slowly. Dustin was 19. His mother, Karen, and I had been together briefly in our mid-30s. A serious relationship that hadn't survived the pressures of 2 demanding careers and a pregnancy neither of us had planned for. We'd parted without hostility, but without real closeness either. Karen had moved to Cincinnati with Dustin when he was 3. I'd paid child support faithfully, visited when I could, which in the early years was more than it became later. By the time Dustin was a teenager, our relationship had thinned to birthday calls and occasional awkward dinners when his school brought him near Columbus. I had never stopped feeling the weight of that distance. I just accepted it as a consequence of choices I'd made when I was younger and less careful. Dustin, I said, how did you hear? Mom saw something on Facebook. Mutual friend of yours, I think. She told me the basics. Another pause. I know we haven't talked much, but I wanted to call. His voice steadied. That's a messed up thing to do to someone. What she did to you. I just wanted to say that. I sat down on the workshop stool. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn. I appreciate that, I said. More than you know. We talked for 45 minutes. Not about the divorce. Not much, anyway. We talked about his job at an auto shop in Blue Ash, how he'd been taking night classes in automotive engineering, how his mother was doing. I told him about Delwood, about the woodworking, about the apartment that was starting to feel like mine. Before he hung up, he said, I'd like to come up sometime, if that's okay. More than okay, I said. You tell me when. He came the following Saturday. Showed up at my door at 10 a.m. in a gray hoodie and work boots, tall the way I'd been at his age, with Karen's coloring in my jaw. We shook hands in the doorway, and then, after a half-second of something unspoken between us, he stepped forward and we embraced, briefly, solidly, the way men do when sentiment matters, but neither one is going to make a production of it. We spent the afternoon in the workshop. He knew his way around tools. Karen had apparently made sure of that, which made me respect her anew. I showed him the table I was working on. He had questions that told me he'd done this kind of work before. Your grandfather taught me, I told him, running a hand along the oak grain. I was about your age. He looked at the wood for a moment. Maybe you could teach me the rest. I didn't say anything. I handed him the plane and showed him the angle. The first formal court hearing was on a Tuesday in June. Robert Hines had spent the previous week walking me through what to expect. Initial asset disclosure review, the paternity declaration motion, and what he called the positioning hearing, the session where both sides establish their narrative before the judge and the real shape of the case becomes clear. Colleen arrived with Deborah Strand and a second attorney I didn't recognize. Strand was polished and prepared, the kind of lawyer who controls a room through sheer deliberate presence. The second attorney, I later learned, handled family communications cases. Colleen had brought a specialist in narrative. I sat with Hines at our table and didn't look at her. The gallery was sparsely attended, a handful of people I didn't immediately recognize, and, in the second-to-last row on the left side, a small, white-haired woman in a navy blue cardigan, sitting with her hands folded in her lap. My mother, Virginia Hurst, 76 years old, who had never once in her life told me what to do, but had also never once failed to show up when it mattered. I hadn't told her about the hearing. She found out through Bart, apparently, and had driven 40 minutes from Westerville without saying a word to me about it. I caught her eye briefly across the room. She gave me a small nod, the same nod she'd given me at my father's funeral, at my college graduation, at every moment in my life when the message was simply, I'm here. Keep going. I turned back to the front of the room. Judge Patricia Drummond was in her early 60s, efficient and unsentimental. She moved through the preliminary matters quickly, then addressed the paternity motion directly. Strand rose immediately. Your Honor, my client acknowledges the circumstances of the birth. However, Mr. Hurst was a willing participant in the pregnancy, demonstrated consistent paternal preparation, and built an expectation of fatherhood that creates an equitable obligation. Counsel. Judge Drummond's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Does your client acknowledge that Mr. Hurst is not the biological father of the minor child? Strand conferred briefly with Colleen in a whisper. She does, Your Honor. And does your client acknowledge that Mr. Hurst was not informed of this prior to the birth? A longer pause. She does. Judge Drummond made a note. Then I'm not sure what equitable argument you're constructing, but I'll hear the rest of it in writing. Mr. Hines. Hines stood and walked the judge through our documentation with the unhurried precision of a man who knows his evidence is sufficient and doesn't need to oversell it. The credit card records. The hotel charges cross-referenced against Colleen's calendar. The will amendment, dated 7 months prior, 2 months into the pregnancy. The Tanner-Briggs connection. Darnell Okafor's formal disclaimer of paternity. When Hines mentioned the PR consultant retained with joint funds after the filing, Judge Drummond looked up from her notes for the first time since he'd started speaking. Joint marital funds, Hines confirmed, used post-filing to engage a communications professional for the purpose of managing public perception of the divorce. The judge looked at Strand with an expression that wasn't quite disapproval, but was in that neighborhood. Strand said, carefully, "My client was managing a very difficult personal situation, Your Honor, and by spending shared assets on a publicity strategy," Judge Drummond said. It wasn't a question. In the gallery, I heard a small sound, not quite a gasp. One of Colleen's friends, a woman named Bev who I'd always found her pasted-on smile slightly unbearable, had her hand over her mouth. 2 seats down, another woman who'd attended our wedding reception was staring at the table in front of her. The narrative Colleen had been building for 6 weeks was dissolving under fluorescent courtroom light. Not because I'd said anything, because the document said everything. After the hearing, in the marble-floored corridor outside the courtroom, Colleen's second attorney approached Hines with a quiet word. A settlement conversation. Colleen was prepared to discuss revised terms. Hines related to me in the parking garage. "Tell them I'm listening," I said, "and tell them to bring something real." On my way to the car, I passed my mother, who was waiting near the elevator. She reached up and put one hand briefly against my cheek. The way she'd done when I was small and had skinned a knee and needed to know the world was still steady. "Your father will be proud," she said quietly. I covered her hand with mine for a moment. Then I walked her to her car, made sure she had her keys, and stood in the garage until her taillights disappeared around the curve. The settlement conversation lasted 11 days. Deborah Strand sent the first revised proposal the morning after the hearing. Hines forwarded it to me at Delwood during my lunch break, and I read it at my desk with a sandwich I'd already forgotten about. The proposal was better than Strand's original position, but still built around the assumption that I'd want to avoid a prolonged public process. There was a clause requiring mutual non-disclosure, another requiring me to make no public statements about the circumstances of the birth. I called Hines from my truck in the parking lot. "They want a gag order dressed up as a mutual agreement," I said. "That's a fair characterization," he replied. "Counter with our original terms. Full asset split honoring the inheritance documentation on the house. The Vermont property remains mine entirely, and no non-disclosure language of any kind. The paternity declaration goes through regardless." "They won't like that last part." "I know," I said. "Send it anyway." What accelerated things was something I hadn't engineered and hadn't expected. Hargrove Consumer Group conducted an internal review. It started, as best as I could piece together later, when someone in Hargrove's compliance department noticed irregularities in departmental expense reports, specifically restaurant charges and one hotel booking that had been submitted for reimbursement under client entertainment budgets. The timeline matched the charges on our joint car precisely. Tanner-Briggs, it turned out, had been submitting some of Colleen's personal expenses through the company's expense system. Whether he'd done it on her instruction or on his own initiative to cover his tracks, I never learned. But the result was the same. Hargrove placed Colleen on administrative leave, pending investigation, on a Thursday morning, exactly 4 weeks after the court hearing. Hines heard about it through the discovery process and called me that afternoon. "Her income documentation just changed significantly," he said. "This affects her financial position in the settlement and undermines her attorney's leverage considerably." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. The grim recognition that the architecture of deception Colleen had built was coming down the way poorly engineered structures always do. Not all at once, but piece by piece, each failure triggering the next. 3 days later, Strand sent a new proposal. It accepted our original terms on the house and the Vermont property. It dropped the non-disclosure clause. The only remaining point of negotiation was the timing of the paternity declaration. I told Hines to give them 48 hours on the time in question and not an hour more. They agreed within 24. The morning the final papers were signed, I was at Delwood by 6 a.m. I ran 2 full diagnostic cycles on the press line, wrote up a maintenance report I've been putting off, and ate lunch with 3 guys from the floor crew who didn't know anything about my personal life and talked entirely about baseball and a truck one of them was fixing up. It was the best lunch I'd had in months. Darnell Okafor, I learned through a business contact several weeks later, had quietly closed his Columbus office and relocated to Atlanta. Whether that was related to our proceedings or something else entirely, I couldn't say. I didn't spend much time thinking about it. What I did think about, sitting in my apartment that evening with a glass of water and the side table I'd nearly finished, was Tanner Briggs. 27 years old, probably out of a job. His professional reputation in a city the size of Columbus effectively ended by the choices he'd made for reasons I'd never fully understand. I didn't feel sorry for him, but I didn't feel much of anything else either. He'd made his decisions. So had everyone else in this. The oak side table was finished by 10 o'clock. I sat against the wall, put my father's photograph on it, and stood back. It looked right. 4 months after the divorce was finalized, Dustin moved to Columbus. He hadn't announced it as a permanent thing. He'd said he was thinking about transferring his apprenticeship to a shop in Hilliard, that the cost of living in Cincinnati was getting unreasonable, that he wanted to be closer to family. He said the word family the way young men say things they mean, but aren't quite ready to make a declaration of, sideways, matter of fact, daring you to respond in kind. I helped him move on a Saturday in October. We loaded his truck in my truck and made 2 trips to a 1-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from mine. By evening, we'd assembled his furniture, ordered pizza, and sat on the floor of his living room because his couch wasn't arriving until Monday. Not bad, he said, looking around at the bare walls and stacked boxes. Needs work, I agreed. I know a guy, he said. I looked at my son, 19 years old, tools in his hands since he could walk, driving 40 minutes to return a wrench, showing up on my doorstep because it was right, and thought about my father, who had taught me to build things and passed me his tools and died without knowing he'd have a grandchild. The circle of that felt significant in a way I didn't try to put into words. We ate pizza and talked until nearly midnight. Before he left the next morning, he stopped in the doorway and said, I know it's not how you planned it, but for what it's worth, I'm glad I'm here. So am I said. More than you know. Virginia came for Thanksgiving. Bart and his wife came. Dustin came. We ate at my dining table. The cherrywood table I'd built myself from a slab I'd found at a salvage yard in Delaware County, sanded down to the grain and finished with 3 coats of Danish oil. 7 people around a table I'd made with my own hands, in an apartment that felt, for the first time, entirely like mine. My mother sat at the end of the table and said grace, the same grace she'd said at every Thanksgiving I could remember, and I watched Dustin bow his head alongside people he'd only known a few months and thought, this is how things get rebuilt. Not in dramatic gestures, in ordinary evenings that accumulate into something solid. The divorce had taken from me something I believed in completely. The future I'd painted yellow and furnished with white oak and filled with books. That was gone, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But the man who'd built that nursery was still here. His hands still knew what to do, and the table we were sitting around was proof that he could build something real from whatever materials were left. I refilled everyone's glasses and passed the rolls. That was a good place to start.